AWOL. I call tonight's City Council work session to order. Mr. Hamp, you call this meeting, so I'll let you take charge.
Yes, sir. I'm glad to do that. Good evening, everyone. Our first item, and we'll deal with this business or information in open session. We simply wanted to provide the council an update or a status on the American Recovery Plan Act and the funds thereby the city will receive, and offer some concepts and the staff's initial thinking about how we might go about or guiding the council to make decisions regarding the investment of those funds. So Mr. Shaw is going to lead us with the status report and then outline some of the concepts around opportunities as we see them, ideas about how we might organize evaluation of potential projects and expenditures, and hopefully get council to a point where you can think about these items and give us some feedback about how you might structure a program for the application of the funds.
Thank you, Mr. Hamp. Mr. Mayor, members of council, good evening.
Good evening.
These funds do originate with the ARP, the American Rescue Plan. The specific program is called the Coronavirus State and Local Fiscal Recovery Funds. And just by way of a reminder, I think we talked about this program during the budget sessions, but at that point, the Treasury had not released guidance, and we didn't know exactly how much funding we were going to receive. So by way of reminder, the purpose of the program is to support public health expenditures in response to COVID-19 mitigation, to address negative economic impacts caused by the public health emergency, both for businesses and households, and impacted industries generally in the public sector, to replace lost public sector revenue, to provide premium pay for essential workers, and then to invest in water, sewer, and broadband infrastructure. And so in terms of supporting the public health response, the types of things that have been recommended, and this is not an exclusive list, it's just for illustrative purpose or examples, but those are vaccination programs, medical expenses for individuals, testing, contact tracing, PPE purchases, many of the things that we discussed with CARES funding, enhancement of healthcare facilities, capital investment in public facilities to meet pandemic operational needs, and ventilation improvements, things of that nature. Also, there are provisions that reference behavioral health care needs that have been exacerbated by the pandemic in terms of mental health treatment, substance abuse treatment, other behavioral issues that folks who have struggled throughout the pandemic, and then to cover payroll expenses for eligible public health and healthcare human service workers. Secondly, addressing negative economic impacts caused by the public health emergency. And again, some of these are programs that would be familiar to you just because of the types of programs that we implemented during CARES, and those are assistance to affected businesses or assistance to households, and especially to industries like the tourism, travel, and hospitality sectors. Thirdly, serving hardest hit communities and families, and there's a fair amount of language in the Treasury guidance that talks about addressing issues of equity and those neighborhoods and communities of color and lower income, where you have disproportionately impacted lower income families. And that could be addressing long-standing health care disparities and determinants, social determinants of health, improvements in housing and neighborhoods generally, addressing educational disparities, and promoting healthy environments, childhood environments, and neighborhood environments. There are some qualifying factors, and there's language about qualified census tracts. You're familiar with LMI neighborhoods from CDBG. It's not exactly the same, but it's a very similar metric. Fourth was, again, replacing lost public sector revenue. And as it's turned out, I think we've had the conversation as we've looked at quarterly financial reports and as we went through the budget process, that we were very conservative going into fiscal year 2021 in our revenue projections, because we were in the early part of the pandemic. We knew that businesses were being shut down, and we didn't know how that might affect our revenues. And as it's turned out, our losses weren't as great as we had projected. So the Treasury does provide a formula that's to be used to determine what you can recover in lost revenue. And for us, it does not look like a big number. And I don't want to get a number stuck in anybody's head, because there's still refinement. The Treasury is currently putting out responses to frequently asked questions, but there's questions about how do your enterprise funds play into that, how does the school system play into that. But for us, it doesn't look like a great amount of money, which is in some ways a shame, because once you recover that lost revenue, you can apply those dollars to a wide range of governmental services without a lot of the restrictions that you would otherwise or will otherwise abide by. But you also have to attach those to specific expenditures that, unlike CARES money, you can't allow that this money falls to your fund balance. You have to attach it to known expenditures. Another provision would be premium pay for essential workers, and this could be paid to public safety, individuals work in your own organization, but they also include grants to child care workers, educators, social service, human service staff, grocery store workers, truck drivers. I mean, the statute lists really, a lot of those frontline workers that were, essential workers and had to come in during the pandemic. Another area of allowed expenditure and investments in water and sewer infrastructure, and that does include stormwater infrastructure. That there are some provisions that basically, if it's a project that would otherwise qualify for certain types of federal funding under whether it's the Clean Water Act, EPA's Clean Water State Revolving Loan Fund, and Drinking Water State Revolving Loan Fund, that those are eligible expenditures, and we've participated in those programs in the past, so we're familiar with what kinds of projects those would include. And then investments in broadband infrastructure, and some of that has been included in some of the guidance that's come from Treasury. That also includes improvements to cybersecurity systems, for instance, investments, and that's an area where the city's actively making new investments, because our systems are vulnerable as any other folks out there on the web. Ineligible uses would include things like any kind of an offset that would allow a reduction in net tax revenue at the state level. That you can't use this basically to backfill fund balance. You couldn't, state can't use this to make a deposit to pension funds and that sort of thing. So I think as we move forward, the city will receive a bit more than $9 million. We've already received about half of that, and in a year or so we will receive the other half of that. All of the funds have to be obligated by December 31st of 2024, and we take that to mean that you have a project that's under contract, you've appropriated money as a council, purchase order has been cut, that you've encumbered the funds, and then the funds have to be expended by December 31st of 2026. So you have really a bit more time to work on this than we had with the CARES fund. There isn't that same rush. And so I think as we've already had staff meeting to talk about potential projects and to start to refine some of the cost estimates that we've had for projects, and we looked at least initially at the projects that are in the existing capital improvement plans, either in the general fund or in water, sewer, stormwater funds, as well as some of the economic development initiatives. I think to some extent, we still would urge that, we wait until some things settle out. In fact, the Treasury is still taking comment on what they call the interim final guidance, which seems like a contradiction in terms, but they're taking comment through the end of this week. And they've already issued at least two what they call FAQs, frequently asked questions. And it was a similar process to CARES, that over a period of time you kept getting these FAQs that really helped solidify how the program was to be administered. And so I think, giving some time for that to shake out, as well as the state is receiving, big portions of this funding, and they're coming out with programs. And for instance, we had anticipated that there would be special assistance to the travel and tourism hospitality industries. And in fact, I think just this week, they've started to release some of those grants. And so, as we had with the experience with CARES, that we started to push money out for various assistance, whether it was to individual households or to businesses. And then pretty quickly, the state started pushing money out for the same purposes. And we thought, well, we would have held our money and directed it to something else had we known that. I think as the council thinks about projects, and the types of projects that you could pretty quickly start talking about are, water and sewer projects, providing water and sewer to the industrial park. I don't think, as we read the current guidance, that you could install water and sewer on the industrial park, but to the industrial park, and that's a $9 million project. That's all of the money available. But we see other water and sewer projects as well, and we're currently doing engineering on a raw water tank at the water treatment facility, and that's $1 million project. There, is really, I don't want to seem fatalistic, but the way the systems work is there's no end to inflow and infiltration. That's sanitary sewer improvements and water improvements. We're currently working on an update to the water system CIP, and so there are lots of projects that could be done there. We've done a good job of working through the stormwater CIP. We've accomplished a lot of the top 10 projects and some more in our CIP there, but as we've talked about with the implementation of the MS4 designation, and with a lot of the work that's coming from Chesapeake Bay or the Chesapeake Bay regulations, we have to shift our focus to water quality improvements and more than water quantity problems. And so there's opportunities there. And in fact, in your next regular council session, we'll talk to you about a potential grant for wetlands or created wetlands in a stormwater pond, similar to what we did at Mulberry Run, similar to what we did at East Pelham. And that's $1 million project. We'll apply for a $500,000 grant, and so you could use these funds to match that $500,000. At least in a preliminary review, we feel like park improvements and these qualifying census tracts would be eligible. So that's your Sunset Park, could be other things. Lots of community development work. We've talked about improvements in a stormwater structure in the downtown that impedes the redevelopment of a large building downtown. That looks to be an eligible expenditure. So, and I think that, we're already getting questions from some of the human services providers, and we're in their service region about, eligible activities that they would request money for. So as you think about how are you going to divvy this money up, I think one of the first messages, or the point of this message, is that $9 million is a lot of money, but that's that you spend 6 or 8 times that in a year's time, so it could go very quickly. We still operate in an environment of scarcity, and so there's going to have to be choices made. And you could debate the merit of individual projects. You may recall in your council retreat where you had the flip charts with projects listed, and you got dots to put on them. Well, your dots are real dollars now. You could do that, or I think at a staff level, you know, the process we go through and trying to recommend projects to the council will be one of saying that really these dollars ought to be used on one-time durable expenditures. That, you know, we wouldn't recommend that you spend great amounts of money on recurring expenditures. I think that there's opportunity with this kind of a windfall to do some pretty dramatic things that would make, you know, a long-term impact in your community. And so that's one of the grading criteria we would use. We also, much as we evaluate capital projects that go on your CIP, as we get our request in from department heads, they fill out a sheet and they have to identify what other funds are available, you know, for a project. Can you leverage other funds? And for council, that could be, you could leverage monies out of your fund balance, you could leverage, you know, bond proceeds, you could leverage grant proceeds, you could say we have a project where we have other partners, somebody else that's making an investment, and then our contribution is leveraging some larger project. We've had, for instance, even preceding this money becoming available, we've had conversations with Habitat for Humanity about a project. They would be, of course, the major investor, but there's work that we've contemplated doing with community development block grant funds with some of these monies, and not a lot. I mean, you're talking six figures, but not millions of dollars. You could top off that project and do a good project in partnership with someone like that. I think one of the issues we kick around is that at a larger level, you know, what might you be trying to accomplish? And some of that would be, you know, in other words, you could say, well, let's do some of these projects so that we can keep rates low. That the raw water tank, the water treatment plant's a good example, where you say, well, if you do that with these grant proceeds, that's gonna mean that $1 million expenditure doesn't go on somebody's water bill. Or you could say, you know, there are certain things that folks ought to be paying for because those are the routine things that government does and we should provide, and that we want to focus on things that we wouldn't otherwise pay for. And I think we end up with a lot of projects that everybody says, yeah, that's a great project, love to do that project, but it gets stalled because you have so many other things that get in front of it. And especially considering that these are funds that have restrictions. So you're gonna, you know, at again, the staff level, we're looking at projects that are already proposed in a CIP or your comp plan or your economic development strategic plan, and saying, well, are there things that, you know, we just haven't been able to get off the ground because there isn't the funding for it. So you have it's a great windfall, and I think, but it's not an endless pot of money, and we're gonna have to think about how do you as a council want to spend it. I think the final, you know, issue would be that, you know, what kind of a process do you want to allow for public participation? And that there is guidance that says you have to have an open and transparent process. You have to at least post, you know, the projects that you're going to work on, and depending on how much money you would appropriate at any one point in time, you could have to have a budget public hearing to amend your budget, things like that. So it's a question that you may want to grapple with, is how do you want to just go through a process of deciding how to spend the money. You do have time, and that's a big difference than, you know, what we faced with CARES, where there was just this push. We knew we were under a very you know, limited time frame to get those dollars spent. So at this point, I think what to expect next, that the staff are reviewing projects and potential costs for projects. As I say, the comment period on the program itself closes this week. We'd like to see how some of the state programs start to shape up and see if there are things that come out of FAQs over the next, you know, several weeks or month that clarify either uses or how we should consider, you know, the administration of the fund. And then I would expect that we would come back to council to start to discuss, a process and then specific expenditures. I've printed out some fact sheets that hand out for council for, that basically, covers the information that I just have. And if you have any questions, I'd be glad to answer.
Well, one question that occurred to me, do we have to accept these funds? We so often accept funds, federal funds, things like that. And if we already have them, have we accepted them?
We have accepted them into our bank account, and I'll get Mr. McCormick to help me, but I think what we did with CARES was that we came to council when we were appropriating out the use of the funds, and then, Cameron, how did the final funds shake out, what will fall to fund balance?
So there was a specific certification from the state that we went through in maybe May or June, and again in September when they put the second allocation of CARES funds out. This one was automatically based on your DUNS number. So once our DUNS number had a hit, I basically went in and certified that we wanted the funds. There was no council action required to receive those.
Okay.
But there will be council action required to spend them of any volume. You could spend small amounts on obviously eligible expenditures like masks and things like that. But if you get into a big project, you're going to have to appropriate the funds.
That's all I have on that.
Other questions?
I mean, I guess what I heard Jim offer was, so I guess my question would be next steps. What I think I heard next steps would be is, are you looking for guidance or direction for a public process? Like some communities are reaching out to their respective communities and establishing a citizen workshop or citizen committee of that. I mean, a pretty easy way for us to do that, we could pick one or two people from every, from our EDA to our planning commission to our other sort of civic organizations, and have them participate and provide feedback. So again, there's part of that transparent process of having a whole collective group of people with different interests. That's how they got on their committees, to participate in the process. And then, again, it is an evolving document. I know this is the fact sheet when we learned that the funds were on their way, and there's been subsequent numerous other iterations since then. And I'll send a copy, or maybe Julia, if you could send a copy. VML, I just literally got it in the mail today, and their July edition, basically the entire magazine is about the use of these funds, and what's eligible based off of their current snapshot and their team of attorneys and stuff. So I guess back to my question is there any particular action or activity for this evening, or is this more for informational purposes?
I think if you have feedback, then certainly, and I think you're hitting the target in terms of our question about what kind of a process do you want to go through. And that, as you say, I think there are communities that will put together stakeholder groups or some sort of steering committee, and to at least provide some feedback and to the council. But yes, I think if you have specific thoughts about that, it's a good time to start to think through that. We're not looking for any particular action tonight, but if you have thoughts on that,
Well, the Harrisonburg model I was pretty impressed with that, and they formed a steering committee of a whole host of different folks. I don't know if they used, for us, I know how hard it can be to shake trees sometimes, but we've got, a full house in the EDA, we've got a full house on the Cultural Commission, we've got a full house on, maybe we've got some folks on our Parks and Rec, and literally pulling in, that might be the best way to pull in, a group of folks that are already present, or already interested and active in the community. And then other stakeholder organizations like, the WARM or the Y or the Boys and Girls Club, just throwing out some ideas.
Yep, that's a good idea to have some involvement, I think.
I think one question that, or idea that I have is, that I would ask council to think about is at what point do you want to, involve the public input? So would you would you like your staff to put together a conceptual program and then have the council respond to that? Are we headed in the right direction? Like, there is a wide variety of opportunity here. Will the council come to some sort of consensus about eliminating certain types of expenditures and having focus in certain areas? And that way, when we get to an input process, some of the field of play has been narrowed, and that we're not spending time discouraging ideas or passing on ideas? Or would you like the public to be involved early and informing some of those broad choices that are available to you?
I mean, I would first offer that maybe the first step would be to solicit council's feedback on their respective things that they might all be interested in.
Right.
And have that help inform and tailor staff's examination of that, and whether or not there are appropriate uses, eligible uses, or likewise. And then use that as to help, frame the box, if you will, but, with maybe a couple exit doors. So that way the public can respond. But at least we're saying, okay, well, based off of, leadership in our organization, from elected bodies to staff's perspectives, these are our range of priorities. We'd like to kind of stay in the lane of these priorities. Not to say if you've got a great idea of how we might want to use it otherwise, but we may not want to spend a lot of time on it, just to be honest with people.
Right.
And I like the idea of having staff input on this before we, start putting our in, see what ideas that they have, because they're seeing the bigger picture, and let us know what ideas that they have and the uses for this money, and then let us chew on that along, and by adding ours in with theirs and see what we can come up with.
I mean, HUD was on not HUD, but Habitat was on, my list of doing a big project. I've talked about that for a long time. Other capital infrastructure projects, the VML perspective published, again, for this month's issue, their interpretation is that you can use it for the maintenance of road construction, maintenance of roads. And so, ever since I've been around, I've always heard of non-eligible roads that exist. Now, there's not tons of them, but there's quite a bit. And, I think to use that as an opportunity, and then to not lose sight of this, and I've shared this a few times, maybe too often with Bobby. I think I've been your on about it. But to not lose fact of the words that are used in this bill and the funds that are associated with it, and that we can treat it as an opportunity. We can treat it as to quell the near-term expenses and future obligations of our citizens. But it's not but if we do those things, it may or may not really be a recovery. The use of the funds to recover the ground that we've lost over a period of a year and a half. And so that would be my only sort of thought out there, is to stay focused on how can we amplify the word recovery in the actions that we take and the way that we use the funds.
I think one of the cities that we looked at, their council fairly early on started to gravitate towards, well, we want to spend percentages of this money on certain things. So in other words, they looked at it as, we don't want to spend 100% of the money on infrastructure, but infrastructure projects are expensive, so maybe we spend 60 or 70% on that. And then, some of the other programmatic things, whether it's special pay to essential workers, well, that doesn't cost as much, but so that's 5%. And you may start to gravitate to that, as Mr. Short kind of alludes to, that if there are things you're simply not interested in, then you kind of weed those out fairly early on. If there are things that you have special interest in, then emphasize the staff effort in trying to to shape up cost estimates or proposals. I think being able to look at a range of projects and their cost it's informative, it's educational, and it'll put things in perspective in terms of order of magnitude, relative to, well, how far will $9 million go? I think, I don't want to debate Mr. Short on the road thing. I haven't read the VML guidance. The Treasury's guidance on it was pretty clear that it basically said, if you have money to recover through revenue recovery, then those dollars can be spent on pretty much the widest range of governmental functions. So whether that's hiring police officers or doing road maintenance, and but that the provision for infrastructure was specific to water, sewer, stormwater, and broadband. So for us, if that number, and again, we've done an initial calculation, that number ends up being $200,000. Well, you could spend that $200,000 on road or bridge maintenance. But at least the Treasury guidance that we've seen is, that was one of the specific questions that came out.
Well, it was the
in
first time today when I saw it in black and white. It's the first time I've seen it in black and white too.
Yeah, so that came out in like the June 24th FAQ from Treasury, and that was a specific question, was, does this include a wide range of infrastructure projects? It's just, yeah, if you have revenue recovery, you can spend that on pretty much any governmental function, but otherwise, you're gonna be limited.
I mean, I think it is a reasonable thing to start having some conversations about what these options mean and continuing to update our knowledge of it. And then when we have a range or a pool of options that we think are reasonable, then to engage with a body to sort of get some feedback and say,
What
are our
flavors of the
priorities?
pie are available, right?
Because if we just start with, hey, how do we want to spend it, we can spend a lot of time spinning our wheels and not getting anywhere, and it'd be better to have some of that groundwork done, I'd say.
Okay.
Well, I think that's, as I'm hearing it, if I'm trying to restate it, is the council is interested in having sort of a broader public participation, but it may behoove us for the staff to spend some time at least developing some better examples, illustrations, expenditures. And as I say, now we are getting some questions from human service organizations, and there are some folks out there that are wondering about how the city's going to spend the money. But otherwise, we've been looking to the CIP, the comprehensive plan, economic development strategic plans, things that have already been vetted in public processes and that the council has taken action on, or a council at some time took action on. And so if there are other ideas that are, more creative ideas or that aren't contained in those plans, we wouldn't say that you should exclude them, but they wouldn't be the ones the staff naturally goes to.
One thing that kind of pops into my mind too is the issue of, early on in the onset of the pandemic, and we were thinking about, well, how are we going to connect with students and the like, and did the partnership with Lumos, and they were kind enough to put the broadcast down at Constitution Park. But what we learned through that is that there were over 110 households in the city that did not have access to high-speed internet. We have the same issue that they have in Craigsville, right? Where it's that cost of that last mile makes it not profitable for the private market to extend that last mile. And many of those areas are actually in Ward A. And that, so, I think that would be an amazing thing to find out. And that's a real recovery, right? I mean, that's a real thing of like, God forbid if that ever happens again, or if, as education continues to evolve, what a great way to market our city and to lay vital infrastructure that makes areas of our community that have not received the benefit of new construction and new, activity, to have this new infrastructure, this vibrant, 21st century infrastructure applied to those parts of our city.
Now,
That's
is
clearly
there-
within the guidance.
Is there a state program that's potentially gonna be stepping into that? Because we keep hearing about sort of state initiatives on rural
Yes.
broadband.
Yes, that's, I think, one of the other things we're watching, and I know that, the state had gone through a comment period, and there were lots of folks lobbying to use these funds for broadband, and there are other state funds, I think, in that regard. And then as well, the schools are receiving, a fair chunk of money, and I know their guidance looks to be a lot more restricted than their CARES money was, and part of that guidance is, how do you catch up students that sort of missed out last year, and whether or not they can invest in technologies like broadband expansion. I'm not certain, but I do know there has been a ton of lobbying. I don't remember what the state's allocation was, but if we receive $9 million, you can imagine what the state's, share is.
Okay, thank you. Our next item is the collective bargaining issue, which we will examine in closed session. You can get a motion and a second, and then a roll call. We'll move into closed session. Just go ahead. We're ready
Okay.
for the
All
motion
right.
when you're ready.
Mr. Mayor, I move this meeting be recessed and that the City Council of Waynesboro immediately reconvene in a closed meeting for the following purposes: discussion and consultation with legal counsel employed or retained by a public body regarding specific legal matters requiring the provision of legal advice by our attorney, as authorized by Section 2.2-3711A8 of the Virginia Code. The subject matter of the meeting is collective bargaining.
Thank you, Madam Vice Mayor. We have a motion on the floor to move into a closed meeting. Do we have a second?
Second.
Thank you, Dr. Hossetter. Any discussion? This requires a roll call vote. Ms. Bordeaux?
Mayor Henderson,
Aye.
Vice Mayor Williams.
Aye.
Councilman Short,
Aye.
Councilman Hostetter.
Aye.
This meeting's in closed.